I want to talk today for about 40 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions on the idea of mourning Lincoln and how I think we should today commemorate his legacy. I will not go into detail about his assassination, but I will talk about the events to a degree, in some degree, just as a way to highlight the significance of his legacy. As all of you know, 150 years ago today, Lincoln was shot. I will begin 5 years before that, in 1860. 5 years before he was murdered. Lincoln, in a really fascinating way, anticipated, almost portended his own assassination. He gave his Cooper Union speech in New York City. As most of you know, it was the first time he had delivered an address to Easterners, Northeasterners, which was crucial for any potential of success in the 1860 election. He felt compelled in his Cooper Union address to distance himself from John Brown and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, John Brown had been hanged 2 months earlier in December of 1859. John Brown remained front page news in every newspaper of the country. John Brown was seen as a central catalyst dividing the nation between the North and South. And Lincoln and most other Republicans had sympathized with Brown's principled opposition to slavery, even though they denounced his violent means to try to end it. And Southerners accused all Republicans of being other John Browns in hiding, so to speak. Now, Lincoln would not know it when he delivered the Cooper Union address, but John Brown would eventually help elect Lincoln to the presidency. Brown's raid precipitated a split in the National Democratic Party, so that it was no longer united North and South. John C. Breckinridge became the Southern Democratic candidate, Stephen Douglass the Northern Democratic candidate. And virtually every Republican recognized that whoever received the Republican nomination, just according to Electoral College and just demographics, would be elected president. John Brown's raid also damaged the reputation of William Seward and Salmon Chase, the two front runners. As president, in fact, Seward felt so confident he was going to win the Republican nomination that he'd already prepared his victory speech. John Brown's raid damages their reputations, and Lincoln, who's much more conservative, emerges as the Republican candidate. Brown's raid also fueled the desire for secession among Southerners. And in his Cooper Union speech, Lincoln wanted to quelch that desire. He did not want secession. And here's what he says in his Cooper Union speech that virtually anticipates or portends his own assassination. He says, in its philosophy, John Brown's raid corresponds with the many attempts related in history at the assassination of kings, emperors, and leaders. An enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people till he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them. He ventures the attempt, which ends in little else than his own execution. Now, in the last sentence, that he ventures the attempt and ends with little else than his own execution, Lincoln is way off base, completely wrong. But in that penultimate sentence, an enthusiast broods over the oppression of a people till he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them. That's a wonderful description or an encapsulation of a revolutionary. And John Brown was nothing if not a revolutionary. What Lincoln did not know when he gave his Cooper Union address was that John Wilkes Booth, another revolutionary, was deeply moved by John Brown's raid. So moved, in fact, that Booth was very anxious, as he said, to attend Brown's hanging. At the time, he was performing at the Marshall Theater in Richmond, Virginia. He learned that the only way to get access to become witness of John Brown's race is to wear a military uniform, to be part of the military. And so he purchased a military uniform. He passed as a soldier. And he essentially had a front row seat at John Brown's execution. He watched Brown hang. He felt dizzy. He asked for a hip flask from a fellow soldier, took a stiff drink. Booth saw in John Brown a fellow revolutionary. Booth himself was a revolutionary, even though these two men's worldviews were diametrically opposed. John Brown sought to realize a multiracial democracy in the United States. That's what he devoted most of his adult life to doing. John Wilkes Booth sought to ensure a pro-slavery nation governed solely by white men. Booth considered slavery the bedrock of a virtuous society, and he believed that constitutional rights existed solely for white men. He lauded John Brown's pluck, however. He lauded Brown's ability to turn words into deeds, and he lauded Brown's composure and eloquence at Harper's Ferry. And in fact, according to Booth's sister, Booth considered Brown a hero when he saw him die. Booth seemed almost envious of Brown's martyrdom and thought Brown far superior to Lincoln and other Republicans. Brown's method of open force was holier than the hidden craft of the Republicans, he said. Booth later elaborated on his comparison of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln when he said, Lincoln was walking in the footsteps of old John Brown, but no more fit to stand with that rugged old hero. Great God, no. John Brown was a man inspired, the grandest character of the century. This is from a pro-slavery Southerner who saw in John Brown and admired in John Brown a fellow revolutionary. Now, whatever else we might say of John Wilkes Booth, he was very savvy in recognizing that Lincoln was averse, very averse, to social revolution. Throughout his career, Lincoln championed very gradual constitutional change. That was his ideal model for change. Lincoln recognized that revolutions very frequently lead to counter-revolutions, which would reverse any social gains, but still left a lot of rotting corpses. And in one sense, you can think of how a revolution functions in a democratic society as like a bowl. I like to use the metaphor of a bowl. In a democratic society, social forces tend toward the center. It's like the bowl is sitting down and the milk flows toward the bottom in the center. Hence, throughout the 20th century in particular, small d Democrats have embraced the vital center. The center, if the center cannot hold, the nation will unravel in this or any democracy. And in a revolutionary time, it's as though the bowl is flipped over and social forces flow out to the sides, which means that the radical side can quickly become a conservative side. In 1861 and 1862, Lincoln, as someone who was deeply averse to revolution, revoked emancipation proclamations because he did not think they were indispensable necessities to saving the Union, which was always his chief aim. He not only resisted emancipation, but he championed colonization. Lincoln colonization is the encouragement of African Americans to voluntarily leave the nation. Essentially, think of colonization as a form of ethnic cleansing. Think of it as imagining the United States as a white man's democracy. Most other white Americans who opposed slavery but were not abolitionists, meaning did not believe in racial equality, if they didn't embrace colonization, they were deeply enamored with it. Lincoln emphasized, however, that he had no control over events that led to emancipation. In fact, one of the lines that Lincoln stated in different ways more than once that I think is crucial to understand, to appreciate Lincoln and his legacy, is when he says, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." Lincoln might have also quoted Edmund Burke, the great critic of revolution, the hero to many conservatives, who said that the leader of a nation must often be content to follow. Now, as you all know, Lincoln, the conservative Republican, would become a revolution over the course of the war. Lincoln presided over the most radical transformation in the nation's history. He became, in essence, an abolitionist, someone who championed not only an end to slavery, but racial equality in theory. And this was highlighted, I think, beautifully when William Lloyd Garrison, as you all know from Boston, just down the road, met with Lincoln in the White House in 1864. And he said, after his meeting with Lincoln, "Of one thing I feel sure, either Lincoln has become a Garrisonian abolitionist, or I have become a Lincoln emancipationist," meaning someone who's only interested in ending slavery but not equality. For I know, that we blend together like kindred drops into one." In a sense, the conservative has become the revolutionary has become a conservative. Another wonderful vision of social revolution. Garrison's statement wonderfully encapsulates this social revolution and Lincoln's radical transformation. And let me give you 5 other examples of Lincoln's beginning the war as a conservative Republican and ending it as a social revolutionary who is embracing equality for all in some form. First is Lincoln's policy toward emancipation. The first Confiscation Act, which was passed in August of 1861, as we now know, is an act that, although it never mentions the word free or freedom, it authorizes Union generals to confiscate slaves who've reached Union lines, clothe them, feed them, put them to work, promises to pay them. And if you're a slave on the ground and you reach Union lines, although freedom is never mentioned, in practice you're free. Lincoln signs that congressional act. And then a year later, in July of 1862, Lincoln signs the Second Confiscation Act, which specifically calls all slaves of rebel masters who've reached Union lines forever free. And that act also calls on the President to issue an Emancipation Proclamation so that both Congress and the Presidency are united in their war aims. And Congress also recognizes that an act from Congress is never read or quoted. A proclamation from the President is widely disseminated and widely remembered. And Lincoln follows through with his Emancipation Proclamation. And then following the end of the war, Lincoln recognizes that the Emancipation Proclamation at the end of the war becomes a dead letter, because the proclamation only governs African Americans during wartime. Lincoln refers to the 13th Amendment, which eventually abolishes slavery, as the King's Cure. He wants to ensure that at the end of the war, Southerners won't be able to re-enslave blacks. And so from 1863 until the end of his life, Lincoln bribes and pressures the border slave states in the Union to emancipate slavery, in part because he knows that if they emancipate slavery, they will support a 13th Amendment, also emancipating slavery. And as he knows, the 13th Amendment requires for ratification 3/4 of the states. Lincoln also, in his final Emancipation Proclamation, calls for the arming of blacks as soldiers as part of the war effort. And as everyone at the time recognized, if you served in the United States military, in the Army and the Navy, if you served in the United States military, that was a sign of your citizenship. You were an equal citizen. Citizenship was widely debated in the United States until the 14th Amendment clarified it. But until then, virtually everyone agreed that if you served in the United States military, you were a citizen. And it's the Emancipation Proclamation that opens the way for the first time of blacks as recruiting blacks into the military. Lincoln also acknowledged the crucial role that black soldiers played in winning the war. He said in 1864, "We cannot spare the 140 or 50,000 blacks now serving us as soldiers, seamen, and laborers. This is not a question of sentiment or taste, but one of physical force, black force, so to speak. Keep it, and you can save the Union. Throw it away, and the Union goes with it." In order to win this war, black soldiers are indispensable. Frederick Douglass had been telling him that from the beginning of the war. But this is a crucial public statement that Lincoln echoes time and again from late 63 to the end of the war. So if emancipation and arming black soldiers are two aspects of Lincoln becoming a revolutionary, the third is that by 1864, Lincoln has embraced John Brown as a national hero. As most of you know, John Brown's Body becomes the most popular song in the Union Army, a kind of Union mascot. And in August of 1864, Lincoln, because of the rise of anti-war Copperhead Northerners, essentially those who hated war, but also those who hated the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, hated the idea of emancipation. He felt sure, and everyone felt sure, that he was going to lose re-election because the war was going so badly, casualty rates were so high. And he had already met and befriended Frederick Douglass. In 1863, Douglass was the first black man to meet with and advise Lincoln 3 times in the White House. The next time a black man met with and advised a U.S. president in terms of equality on that level was when Martin Luther King Jr. met with and advised Lyndon Johnson 9 times in the 1960s. But King and Johnson never defined themselves as friends. Douglass and Lincoln, from the first meeting, defined themselves as friends. And one of the definitions of friendship at the time is that two people are equals. Lincoln, wondering what he should do about the prospect of losing re-election to a Copperhead Democrat who becomes George McClellan, and recognizing that if the Democrats win in 1864, essentially that's a Confederate victory, because the platform in 64 is a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy, which would almost certainly leave slavery intact. He sends a telegraph wire to Frederick Douglass's home in Rochester, asking him to come to the White House because he needs him. The presidential carriage is waiting to take Douglass to the White House, and when he meets Lincoln, Lincoln says, "I need you, and here's why I need you. I think I'm going to lose re-election. What I would like you to do is embark upon a John Brown scheme." John Brown, I now realize, is a hero. Become another John Brown, in which you take some hand-picked men like Brown did, raid the South, try to spark a major insurrection, which is what Southerners would call it, by which he meant bring as many blacks into Union lines and freedom as possible. Best case scenario, tens of thousands of blacks will come into Union lines. It'll allow us to form many more regiments, achieve a major military victory, which will turn the tide of public opinion and help me get reelected. Worst case scenario, I lose re-election. Democrats prevail. The Confederacy remains a separate nation. Slavery remains intact, but at least tens of thousands or more blacks will have been brought into Union lines and thus into freedom. Douglass says that he never recognized the degree to which Lincoln hated slavery as at that moment. And it's a profound shift from Lincoln's statement just 4 years earlier when he sees Brown as a revolutionary, and it's not particularly a good thing in his Cooper Union address. Another example of Lincoln Lincoln embracing John Brown as a hero is numerous instances in which he sings John Brown's body. And then he sings Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was inspired by John Brown's body. The fourth example of Lincoln's revolutionary transformation is that he publicly credits black and white abolitionists, especially Massachusetts abolitionists, or people who had lived in Massachusetts, for influencing him and for their role in ending slavery and winning the war. At the second inaugural, which is the third time Frederick Douglass meets with Abraham Lincoln, Douglass is invited to the inaugural. He has essentially a front row seat. John Wilkes Booth is also up in the balcony. I'm coming out with a book on Frederick Douglass and photography. In the second inaugural, I show, and I've circled Booth in the balcony and Douglass right in front so you can see both of them. Douglass attends the reception at the White House after the inaugural. Initially, he's turned away at the door, a policeman saying no blacks are allowed to enter. Douglass says there must be some mistake. He enters. Lincoln is in the elegant East Room surrounded by a crowd of whites, and when he sees Douglass enter, he raises his long arm and he yells out, "Here comes my friend Frederick Douglass. I saw you in the crowd today. What did you think of my inaugural address? There is no man in these United States whose opinion I value more than yours." Douglass responds, "Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort." That's saying to a crowd, a room filled mostly with whites, that I value a black man's opinion more than anyone else in the country. It's an extraordinary statement. Another example is that Massachusetts Lieutenant Daniel Chamberlain recounts shortly after Lincoln told him this, something that he basically quotes Lincoln, who said to Chamberlain, "I have been only an instrument. The logic and moral power of Garrison and the anti-slavery people in the country and the army have done all." Another extraordinary instance of Lincoln giving credit, so to speak, where credit is due. And finally, the fifth example of his revolutionary transformation is in his last public address from the White House on April 11th in 1865. Lincoln endorses a limited form of black suffrage. He says, "It is unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored men. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." Now, a lot of people in the recent few decades have been very critical of Lincoln for this statement of limiting suffrage in April of 1865 solely to veterans and what he calls the very intelligent. But the context of this statement is that for Lincoln and for abolitionists, the question wasn't if we should grant black suffrage, but when and how many. And Lincoln is very clear, saying, my own view is that right now, in April of 1865, veterans and the very intelligent should have suffrage, and we'll move from there. And he's very clear in that speech that he is open to change. Abolitionists were debating the same thing. And this shift from emancipation to full suffrage is virtually unprecedented. In fact, is unprecedented in other New World emancipation societies. Now, John Wilkes Booth was in the audience when Lincoln gave his last public address, when he announces his vision of limited black suffrage. Booth and several Confederate soldiers had for much of the war, especially after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, they had schemed to try to kidnap Lincoln and demand in exchange for him tens of thousands of rebel prisoners to be released so that it could energize the Confederate effort. Booth and his conspirators almost certainly received money from the Confederacy. They met with Confederate spies in Montreal, and one of Booth's comrades met with Confederate Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin, who oversaw the South Secret Service operations. I say that to emphasize that to understand Booth and his conspirators, think of them as Confederates. Think of them as kind of in Confederate intelligence. But Booth's kidnapping scheme was now much less viable because 2 days later on April 9th, Lee had surrendered to Grant. And when Booth hears Lincoln endorse voting rights for black men, he became furious. He told a comrade, "That means nigger citizenship. It is the last speech he will ever make." It was this speech of Lincoln endorsing a limited form of black citizenship or black suffrage. This speech, coupled with Lee's surrender 2 days earlier, that convinced Booth to assassinate Lincoln and abandon his plan to kidnap him. You could say that Booth put a bullet through Lincoln's head for the same reason that Garrison lauded him, because Lincoln had become an abolitionist and thus a revolutionary. Now, in murdering Lincoln, Booth imagined himself becoming the John Brown of the South. He imagined himself becoming a martyr beloved by Southerners who would redeem his slaveholding nation. It didn't turn out that way, at least for a while. To be sure, throughout the unoccupied South, meaning throughout this in the Confederate states where there were no Union troops, rebels rejoiced over Lincoln's assassination. After all, they were seeking to establish their new nation that was diametrically opposed to the Union. And in fact, in several occupied areas where there were Union soldiers, Booth sympathizers were forced to wear placards across their chest that said, "Assassin Sympathizer." Huge placards, marks of shame. Northern fury against the South was unprecedented in the wake of Lincoln's assassination. As the historian Edward Blum has noted, in the months after Lincoln's assassination, a large number of Northerners, probably a majority, imagined a nation in which freed people would become full American citizens almost immediately. And these voices dominated the public discussion. At the same time, many, if not most, blacks believed that a new era had commenced, in which racial prejudice would be exterminated. Talk about a revolutionary idea. Their loyalty to the nation, their willingness to fight and die for the Union, and their crucial aid in winning the war convinced many white Northerners to accept them as citizens with equal rights. And in fact, in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, some Northerners went so far as to invert racial stereotypes. They depicted Confederates as the racist other. For example, one Brooklyn man said, "The Southerner cannot be a brother of mine, for he belongs to no race of mine." Before the war, most white Americans imagined the devil as black. After Lincoln's assassination, many, if not most, Northerners had reconceived of the devil as Southern. Artists for both Frank Leslie's Illustrated and Harper's Weekly, two of the most popular and widely disseminated newspapers, both portray John Wilkes Booth and Jefferson Davis as devils. Frederick Douglass brilliantly encapsulated the meaning in the tragedy of Lincoln's death. And Douglass's example is representative of what happened in so many cities and towns throughout the North. He learned of the assassination on the day Lincoln died, on April 15th. Everywhere in Rochester, people immediately began mourning, and they wanted a public, collective form of mourning. So spontaneously, he and many, if not most of the citizens of Rochester, adult citizens of Rochester, gathered at City Hall, a very large venue. And Douglass, who was renowned as one of the greatest orators in the country, was asked to give a speech. It was an impromptu speech, completely extemporaneous. He hadn't prepared. He heard the news. He walked out his door. He wanted to commune with his fellow Rochesterians, and delivers, in my view, a brilliant speech, short but brilliant. And he encapsulates, I think, a wonderful meaning, or an important meaning, of Lincoln's assassination and ultimately of his legacy. He says, "Though Abraham Lincoln dies, the Republic lives." The president's death had suddenly united blacks and whites in the North as never before, making us kin, as he said. Children, part of the same family. Lincoln's martyrdom became for Douglass a symbol of racial reconciliation and forgiveness. Forgiveness for the long history of racial tensions. Douglass likened Lincoln to America's Christ. He said, it may be that the blood of our beloved martyred president will be the salvation of our country. People would be united, made kin by their loyalty to their nation rather than their complexion. A nation that's now an anti-slavery nation, grappling and seeking to pass these Reconstruction amendments. It was in these weeks and months after Lincoln's assassination that the ratification of the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery was secured, and that the foundations of the 14th and 15th Amendment, which guarantee citizenship to everyone and equal protection before the law to everyone, and unrestricted suffrage to black men, though the foundation of those two amendments were also laid. And these constitutional amendments, these so-called Reconstruction amendments, coupled with civil rights legislation that legally desegregated most public establishments, coupled with the extraordinary rise of black literacy and black office holders throughout the country, was truly unprecedented. Such legislation, such dramatic revolutionary rise of literacy among a group of people who had been prohibited from reading and writing as slaves, was unique in emancipation societies throughout the New World. And remember that the New World, every acre of land in the New World was a slave society in 1770. Then, of course, shortly after the 15th Amendment was ratified, the counter-revolution, which Lincoln had so feared, gathered steam and ultimately prevailed. And from the turn of the century through at least the 1930s and for many into the 50s, Lincoln was celebrated by whites chiefly as a symbol of reunion among Northern and Southern whites. He was and still is for many America's Christ, a white nation, rather than a martyr for a multiracial democracy. Let me summarize what I think should be Lincoln's legacies for us today, and I'll draw on some both implicit and explicit points I've made in the story I've told. One is Lincoln's legacy on race. What is his legacy on race? In my view, it is his extraordinary capacity for change. After all, he begins his presidency championing colonization. In fact, when he gives his inaugural address, he vows to add teeth to the fugitive slave law, and he endorses the first 13th Amendment, which Congress had just passed in the hopes of conciliating with secessionists. Endorsed the first 13th Amendment, which is an amendment that guarantees slavery in the slave states forever. Frederick Douglass, when he read Lincoln's inaugural address, was so outraged that he planned to go to Haiti and move there because he figured there's no way this nation could ever fulfill its ideals with this guy as president. That's where Lincoln starts as president. He's a champion of colonization. For the first 2 years of war, he's championing colonization. But then he becomes, as I've outlined, an abolitionist. One that William Lloyd Garrison says is kindred, like a kindred to me, indecipherable from me. He goes from accepting a white man's democracy to a multiracial democracy. In essence, as both Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois would emphasize in different ways, Lincoln was big enough to be inconsistent. And given the power of racism in American society, that ability to be inconsistent, that ability to change, is crucial. It's what explains why Frederick Douglass would say of Abraham Lincoln in 1861 and 1862 that he's a representative racist, and then befriend him in 63, and even more so in 64 and 65. Because white Americans, at some point in their lives, and for many, if not most, at a lot of points in their lives, are racists. The ability to change, to grow, to be inconsistent is what allows them to burst free of this power. The other reason why this capacity, this extraordinary capacity for change is so important is because both slavery and racism depend upon the idea of fixity. They depend upon a self remaining the same. After all, slavery is based on the idea that there is a very low ceiling above which you cannot rise. And racism, among other things, is defined by the belief that one group of people are permanently superior to another group of people. Whereas if you imagine the self as continually evolving, continually in a state of flux, always able to change, ever changing, racism and slavery get exploded. Lincoln, in his capacity to change, his capacity to grow, is diametrically opposed to someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you know Nathan Bedford Forrest, you know that he, like Lincoln, grows up in a border state, born dirt poor in a log cabin. But Nathan Bedford Forrest, he rises up, but he rises up because he becomes one of the wealthiest slave traders by the eve of the Civil War. And then during the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest becomes a Confederate cavalry general, and after the war, he helps found the Ku Klux Klan. That's a direction that Lincoln could have gone. He doesn't. And for that, his accomplishment is extraordinary. Because the tendency would be for him to do that. If you're interested in becoming wealthy, if you're interested in acquiring social status, you would have taken that route that Forrest took. Second, Lincoln's legacy on freedom and equality of opportunity highlight his sense of humility. I've already quoted examples of Lincoln denying that he is responsible for the social revolution, that he is not an agent of change, that he's been influenced by others, which is an extraordinary trait, especially among a president. As the nation's leader, Lincoln had the humility to admit that he had no control over certain events that led to emancipation. He understood, in essence, that the leader of a nation must oftentimes be content to follow. The great African-American journalist and historian Lerone Bennett wrote a book on Lincoln that's famously called Forced into Glory. Now, for Lerone Bennett, Lincoln being forced into glory was a criticism. For me, it's a compliment. In part because Lincoln acknowledged as much himself. He acknowledged, in essence, that he was forced into glory. Because he had the humility to listen to these people who were comparatively powerless, African Americans, poor whites, and recognize that a social revolution was in his midst, and accept it, and run with it, and embrace it, even as president, in which his chief aim was to preserve the Union and support the Constitution. In essence, Lincoln's legacy on freedom and equality of opportunity highlights the degree to which Lincoln recognized that social change stems not from those in the seats of power. It's not from our leaders or the presidents or Congress. That's not how social change occurs. Neither does social change stem from radicals at the margin, but rather it's a continuous interaction between the two, a kind of dialectic. It requires a collaboration between people of very different beliefs, passionately held different beliefs, who work together, some in the seats of power, some on the margins. And that's a wonderful symbol of democracy. People working with, collaborating, befriending people who believe things very differently than they do. Lincoln accepted a social revolution even though he was afraid of its prospects. A wonderful example of Lincoln's legacy on freedom and equality of opportunity is encapsulated by Frederick Douglass in 1876, which is really the end of this kind of social revolution where blacks are office holders throughout the South. It's when the counter-revolution that essentially returns blacks to a state of unfreedom, denies them equal rights, begins or ramps up. And Douglass is asked to give the keynote address for the unveiling of the Lincoln Monument in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C. And Douglass gives this address before President Grant and the Supreme Court and Congress. Basically, all of the heads of state are there. Mostly whites, some blacks. And he begins it, there's an unveiling of the Freedmen's Monuments, this kneeling slave. Douglass hates it, although he doesn't say it at the time, because it's a paternalistic image of this kneeling slave suggesting that whites preside over emancipation. Douglass begins his address by telling these heads of state, "You are Lincoln's children." And then he says, we blacks are merely his stepchildren, which I can imagine shocked a lot of the people in the audience, prompted gasps. And then Douglass embarks on one of his great reversals. He said, to appreciate Lincoln, you have to understand who he was and what he was called upon, what he was elected to do. To judge Lincoln on abolition grounds, he's dull, tardy, backward, not someone to uphold. But that's not how we should judge him. He was never elected as an abolitionist. He never would have gotten elected as an abolitionist. He was always a politician, always a lawyer, and he took an oath of office to preserve the Union and protect the Constitution. And yet, even though he took an oath to protect the Constitution, preserve the Union, he had the open-heartedness to adopt us African Americans as part of this national family. That is his great accomplishment. So judging him on who he actually was, a statesman, a lawyer, a president, he was radical, he was revolutionary, he was someone we need to pay close attention to for our legacy. Another example of Douglass recognizing, and Lincoln both, recognizing his own legacy in relation to freedom and equality of opportunity is in our understanding of emancipation. Most white Americans, I would argue today, still believe that Lincoln freed the slaves, even though Lincoln himself would have denied it. And Frederick Douglass says of the Emancipation Proclamation that it's one of the greatest documents in American history, not only because it arms blacks, but because of its symbolic nature. He says it turns the war into a moral crusade rather than simply a battle over territory. And he said it should be celebrated as part of the twin births of liberty with the Declaration of Independence. And Douglass then said in the speech that we know Lincoln read, make no mistake, Lincoln does not free the slaves with this Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation is a long chain that involves numerous factors. Most important are the blacks themselves on the ground flocking to Union lines, freeing themselves in a sense. Congress passing the First and Second Confiscation Act, calling on Lincoln to issue Emancipation Proclamation. The Army, who is accepting and embracing blacks. The wonderful example is Union generals. Virtually none of them are abolitionists at the beginning of the war, urging to Lincoln to free the slaves, saying, as a military officer, as a general, my job will be much easier if you free the slaves. We can use them as intelligence. We can use them as soldiers, as workers. My job will be infinitely easier if you free the slaves. It's a wonderful example of how social change is this dialectic, or this combination of people from the seats of power all the way to the margins. The third example of the third aspects of Lincoln's legacy, I have 5, is his flawed nature. And this is also something that Douglass pointed to, that Du Bois pointed to. Since Lincoln's death, too many white Americans have wanted to see Lincoln as America's Christ, by which they see him as flawless, as perfect, as never having made a mistake, which means they have to gloss over the somewhat unseemly aspects of his career, like colonization, like endorsing the first 13th Amendment, which protects slavery everywhere. Many white Americans still use the mantra, what would Lincoln do? What would Lincoln do? For those of you who know religion, that's essentially an evangelical mantra. What would Jesus do? What would Lincoln do? Instead of asking that question, I think it's important to look at what Lincoln actually did do and recognize his capacity for change, the complicated nature of his evolution, his acceptance of a revolution, his ability to work with so many different people, people who were so dramatically different from himself. And the fourth is that Lincoln was a very astute observer of a counter-revolution. He recognized the degree to which a social revolution in a society can so easily lead to a counter-revolution that will reverse the gains. And he was absolutely right in this sense. Had he lived is another question, but I will say Lincoln had a long history of holding out an olive branch as a way to get people who differed from him to do what he wanted. And if they repudiated on the olive branch, meaning they didn't do what the agreement was, he could be very hard-nosed. So one of the most frequently asked questions is what if Lincoln had lived? It's unclear whether or not Lincoln could have helped to avert the social revolution. We do know, as Beverly said, that Andrew Johnson was the most racist president in American history, and certainly no friend of blacks, as Frederick Douglass said on meeting him. But the social revolution and Reconstruction was a very messy affair. And the one thing I can say with near certainty is that had Lincoln lived, he would not be anointed nearly as much by anyone on any side today. After all, he's killed on Good Friday, he dies on Holy Saturday. It's natural that people would see him as America's Christ. And finally, I've quoted Lincoln a fair amount. The last legacy is the power of language and of literacy. Lincoln has less than 1 year of formal education, like Frederick Douglass. And yet he becomes, with Frederick Douglass in my view, among the greatest nonfiction writers in the English language. Lincoln urged every American to become a reader and a writer, as did Frederick Douglass, because both recognized that in a democracy, literacy is absolutely essential for it to function. Because literacy and a command of language is what allows us to distinguish between a Democrat and a demagogue, between a self-made man and a con man. And if we don't have literacy, we won't recognize someone who's a demagogue versus a Democrat, someone who's trying to cheat us versus someone who is a self-made man. And that's absolutely central. Lincoln has inspired millions of Americans for very different purposes, as I've mentioned, since his death to today. I hope that he will continue to inspire us, but in a very specific way. I hope that Lincoln's legacy will inspire us to unite as he was able to do, to work together with people very different from himself as he was able to do, and to fulfill, finally, the nation's ideals of freedom and equality of opportunity for all Americans. Thank you.
I wish I knew that much about Lincoln, and more people knew that much the way he wrote about the concept of what he did, who he was, inspired. So I think it's a message that needs to be brought out to
Thank you.
anybody who wants to listen. Just fast forward, the issue about racial injustice or racism, I thought about it many years, over the years, and I think you put words to it in terms of feeling a group of people, doesn't have to be black or white or green, is irreparably less than you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's and the concept of white privilege,
right, is also
is that the topic together?
Yes. The concept of white privilege goes hand in hand with the concept of anti-black racism or anti-Indian racism or other forms. So racism is the belief in innate inferiority of a certain group of people, which presupposes the superiority of another group of people. We've known for a long time that race, the very idea of race, is a social fiction. It's a social fiction because scientists know, and there's tons of evidence, and there has been for a long time, that there's far more differences within any group that anyone has ever characterized as one race than there is between what we call as races. So if that's the case, the lines that we're drawing for black or white or red or whatever is fiction. And yet these terms continue to govern in certain respects American society. I like to say that especially in England, class is kind of the governing structure or metaphor. I mean, British people say they can recognize the class of another Brit just by their voice, sometimes by their look. And in England, there's upper class, upper middle class, there's 9 different classes, very subtle deviations. Race is functioning in America in similar ways. And even today, I would argue that it's a minority. There has been considerable strides, but there are still a minority of white Americans who will view an African American solely by the skin color, regardless of what kind of success he or she has achieved, what kind of status he or she has achieved. So hence numerous, I mean, it's almost countless references to President Obama, referring to him as a kind of the monkey in chief, which is, I mean, talk about racist. Or seeing him as illegitimate, the whole birthing notion in 2008. You know, they can't say he's an illegitimate president because he's black, so they make up another reason, say it's illegitimate for a black man to be president. And so, as I said, I think there has been some progress, but there's still a hardcore of white Americans who will only gauge black Americans in terms of this fiction called race. Yes, that's very good. So, thank you for mentioning that. So he's referring to Billy the Barber, as he was known, in Springfield. And Lincoln was a friend, although I would say that Lincoln did not see Billy the Barber as a social equal in his time in Springfield. In fact, in Springfield, the state of Illinois had what was called sundown laws, and in the books, laws that prohibited blacks from living there as citizens. Now, they were often overlooked as they were in Springfield, but Lincoln often frequented Billy the Barber's shop and interacted with him, as did other men. In every instance we know, Lincoln genuinely felt comfortable around African Americans, whether it's through Billy the Barber or from all of the African Americans that he met in the White House. Lincoln met with more African Americans in the White House than all previous presidents combined, and it wouldn't be until well into the 20th century where another president would equal that record. And but the difference between Billy the Barber, in my view, and Frederick Douglass is that Lincoln sought out Douglass's advice for reasons of state or for law in the way that his friendship with Billy the Barber was a different kind of a friendship. Oh, I think, yeah. Were there remnants of the memories of the revolution in Haiti? I'm certain they were. One of the big losses in the archives is I would love to discover a cache of writings about the relationship between Billy the Barber and Lincoln. We really don't know. I mean, the upshot is we don't know. Lincoln did refer to Frederick Douglass, but he really doesn't mention Billy the Barber. And so it's a huge gap in the scholarship. But certainly Lincoln was familiar, not only familiar, Lincoln was the first president since John Quincy Adams, although Quincy Adams does this after his presidency, to seek to recognize Haiti. And it's really Charles Sumner who specifically recognizes Haiti. And Lincoln recognizes the heroic nature of the Haitian Revolution, the great heroic nature of the Haitian Revolution. As I said, Lincoln is averse to revolution, but that doesn't mean he applauds it when it happens, as it does in Haiti and as it does at the end of the war. The Civil War. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Haitian Revolution, in 1791, Haiti had been, or Saint-Domingue as it was called, was considered the crown jewel of France because it was responsible for lining the pockets of so many white Frenchmen. And it was the wealthiest slave colony in France. Slaves rose up in rebellion. And Toussaint L'Ouverture becomes the great hero of the Haitian Revolution, in part by convincing the free black population to side with the slaves in fighting against the three most powerful armies of Europe: England, France, and Spain. And between 1790s and 1804, they defeat the three most powerful armies in Europe. And Haiti declares itself a black republic with a constitution that forever abolishes slavery. I mean, it's an amazingly heroic achievement. One of the last speeches it's never before been published. I'm going to publish it in this book. It's basically a portable Frederick Douglass I'm doing. One of the last speeches Frederick Douglass, or last essays Frederick Douglass writes, is this essay on Toussaint and the Overture, and the degree to which Toussaint and the Overture had been such a huge inspiration on Frederick Douglass. So Douglass and those who, certainly abolitionists, and certainly Lincoln by mid-Civil War, looked to Haiti as a great inspiration. Charles Sumner, who's the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, grew up right down the street in a black neighborhood, actually 45 seconds away from here, in a boarding house. Sumner's father goes to Haiti in 1794. So it's in the midst of the Saint-Domingue Revolution. It's when everything is still in balance, before things have been determined. And Sumner's father has no money. That's why he goes to sea. He supports the black rebels. He's one of the very few white Americans who supports the black rebels in Haiti and Saint-Domingue. He returns to the United States in as early as 1812, 1815. Charles Sumner's father says he would be proud to serve before a black judge, proud to serve before an interracial jury. And Sumner, who grows up in this, he grows up believing in the great vision and power and symbol of Haiti. He helps to ensure Haiti's independence beginning in 1872, when one of U.S. Grant's platforms is to annex Santo Domingo, which is the Dominican Republic. And Sumner recognizes that if the United States annexes Santo Domingo, Haiti is not going to long remain as an independent republic. And he leads the effort to prevent that. I mean, Springfield was a good place for Lincoln to really emerge as a lawyer, as a congressman, as a leader, because Springfield had a very tight-knit black community. So it's there he befriends Billy the Barber. When he moves to Springfield, he has some other, he interacts with blacks on a daily basis. When he goes to Washington, D.C., he's the first president who hires African Americans as part of his White House staff, who are paid the same as white workers are. Lincoln has, because of his lack of education and because of his pronounced accent, Lincoln would have pronounced his name Lincoln or Lincoln, and for many Yale and Harvard and college-educated men, Lincoln sounded like a Yahoo. And when Lincoln was first elected, I mean, someone like William Seward, who was had an impeccable education, I mean, he completely dismissed Lincoln out of hand almost. Someone like Frederick Douglass recognized early on, even when he disagreed with Lincoln, he recognized Lincoln's brilliance as a writer. And in fact, many astute Northerners recognized that despite his kind of down-home look, I mean, Lincoln did not own a suit that fit him until 1860. When he comes to give the Cooper Union address, because he's 6'4" and his arms are so long and his legs are so long, he needed a tailor-made suit, and he spent $260 in New York for a suit to deliver his Cooper Union address. And before then, his sleeves came up to about here. I mean, the three words that were most used to characterize Lincoln, for people who didn't know him, especially in the East, are ugly, awkward, and grotesque. Seriously, that's how people viewed him. Southerners referred to him as an ape. They were just ruthless in critiquing what they considered his ugliness. There's also the racial connotation because of his anti-slavery. But people fairly quickly recognized, who are astute, that despite his lack of polish, here was someone who was a very deep thinker, who was willing to accept advice, who was willing to interact and befriend people who were very different from himself. His very act of choosing his cabinet reflected his willingness, his desire to work with people totally different from himself. His cabinet members, he didn't choose his own cronies. He chose people who were self-consciously, he recognized they were very different from him. Now, Doris Kearns Goodwin argues that his team of rivals, his cabinet, was part of the reason for his great leadership and success. I agree with her that he was a great leader, but his cabinet was dysfunctional by 1862. Truly dysfunctional. 2 of them resigned. I mean, that was not, but at least he tries. At least that's an example of him reaching out to people who are very different from himself. I mean, a wonderful example is Charles Sumner's relationship with Lincoln. Sumner was very poor. He goes to Harvard. He's probably the poorest kid who goes to Harvard, then law school, and he remakes himself through education and is one of the most intellectual congressmen in the United States. By the time he was known for memorizing every speech, littering it with Latin and Greek phrases. His hero was Cicero. Many congressmen didn't even know who Cicero was. And when he meets Lincoln, here's this polished intellectual, and his initial reaction, you would think, would be, this is this yahoo. But he recognizes early on that both of them had struggled up in very different ways, and despite their obvious differences, in my view, Sumner and Lincoln were closer than any other congressman with Lincoln. Sumner met with him virtually every day. They appreciated their differences. Sumner was always a radical. Lincoln, came to that position. But they genuinely liked each other. The biggest gap is, frankly, their attitudes toward humor. Lincoln was a brilliant student of what Mark Twain would call Southwestern humor. Lincoln was famous for cracking jokes, especially during really tense instances. So when he announced to his cabinet that he was going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, make it public, he began it by telling a joke. And telling a kind of a bawdy joke. It would be like slapstick today, as a way to put his listeners at ease. Sumner was accused of not knowing how to laugh. I disagree with that, but he's accused of not knowing how to laugh. And yet they get along beautifully. I mean, Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, Frederick Douglass says after his first meeting, he said, President Lincoln treated me as a man, not as a black man. They were similar in some respects in their lack of education, but were very different. And Lincoln had this capacity to accept individuals for who they were and to seek to want to work with them. Yeah. So Douglass was appointed ambassador in 1881 by, who was it? Cleveland, I think. Wait a second. No, Harrison. And he steps down because he's asked to be he's the first black ambassador to Haiti, and he's appointed, and he's not listened to. He goes to Haiti, he lives there for a year and a half. He sends memo after memo to Haiti saying to achieve a healthy relationship between the United States and Haiti, here's what the United States needs to do. And the United States flagrantly ignored that. And so Douglass said, I'm treated as like a puppet, a figurehead. He comes back. And he publishes 2 long essays in North American Review outlining his critique of the administration's attitude toward Haiti, essentially wanting Haiti to do the U.S.'s bidding, just to be almost like a colony of Haiti rather than to really treat it as a mutually independent republic like the United States. And that's what Douglass was championing. So he spent 2 years there. He was, on all accounts, he liked it there a lot, but was especially deeply frustrated with the administration. This was a time in which Douglass recognized the counter-revolution of white Southerners was in full swing. It was, in fact, during this time that Charles Sumner's Civil Rights Act, which was passed into his honor, was overturned. It becomes the blueprint for Johnson's 1964 Act. So it essentially legitimates Jim Crow segregation throughout the former Confederate states and legitimates the denial of black suffrage. So Douglass he's fighting a lot of things at this time, but he refuses to be a puppet. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So how much of Lincoln's humility was calculated and how much was genuine? And it's a great question in part because Lincoln had a brilliant sense of public opinion, in terms of understanding, getting a handle on general public opinion and speaking to it. In some instances, it was to his embarrassment from our perspective today. So his great speech encouraging blacks to colonize, inviting blacks, DC blacks to the White House, and then just lecturing to them and say, you guys should all leave and go to Africa. Basically, the context is it was right before he issues his Emancipation Proclamation. He wants to appease border state slaveholders. But there's very good evidence long before he became a public figure that throughout his life he expressed this deep sense of humility. Joshua Speed is his closest friend in life, and Speed on numerous occasions was just awed by Lincoln's willingness to, for example, Lincoln said openly, he said, I'm a really slow learner. It takes me a long time to get something down. But once I do, it's down. I mean, how many people are going to say, how many people aspiring, truly ambitious people are going to say that? And he's saying that to a friend. Speed, remembers that and writes it down. There are all kinds of examples of Lincoln expressing privately a sense of humility, acknowledging his weaknesses, acknowledging his flaws. And so yes, when he's president, there's a certain way in which his acts of humility are timed, I would say, but he's still willing to express this public humility in a way that is distinct from truly every other president in the United States as president. Yeah. That's a great question. So why is the film industry so backward and, I'll say, colorblind about Douglass's brilliance? I think for two reasons. I've written on the film Lincoln Spielberg. One is that the film industry is a great way as an index, a great index in a sense for race relations, because every Hollywood film is a big business. A low-budget film is $80 million. Spielberg's Lincoln was what, $150 million? He put it on hold during the Great Recession of 2008, which cost millions more, which means that you have to, one, dumb down the language. In fact, I'm friends with some Hollywood filmmakers, and they say that the writers in Hollywood, their goal is to write for a 6th to 8th grade audience. Because if they aim higher, they're going to lose a lot of people. And if they lose a lot of people, the film's going to lose money or not make money. And if the film doesn't make money, no matter how, even if you're Spielberg, if you lose money, you're not going to get another film. Because the money people are surrounding it. So that's one problem in terms of trying sensitively and accurately to portray race in the United States. Spielberg, in Amistad in particular, has a blind spot in his attitudes toward abolitionists, black and white abolitionists. And the Lincoln film is a great example. In the Lincoln film, the Thaddeus Stevens champions racial equality for reasons not of principle, but out of his love for his housekeeping. There's zero evidence that he was actually had a sexual relationship with Lydia. Zero evidence. And in fact, the scene, the camera, it's from above and you see them suddenly in bed together. I felt sucker punched. It's like, okay, this is how we explain Stevens, because he's, you know, having sex with his black housekeeper, so of course he's going to champion racial equality. And then in the film, he doesn't become heroic until he repudiates his belief in racial equality as part of the discussion for the 13th Amendment. So for Spielberg, the idea of acting out of principle in any way is really problematic. Lincoln becomes a hero in that film because he's a brilliant, pragmatic politician who's willing to get his hands dirty in the dirtiness of politics. That's part of Lincoln's brilliance in that film. The same was true in Amistad. There's also, however, an understanding that Douglass was such a, I mean, Hollywood people do realize this, Douglass was such a brilliant orator. And if you're going to cast a Frederick Douglass, what actor could ever inhabit Frederick Douglass? What actor could, I mean, in my view, maybe Denzel Washington. There's some great actors. I will say, though, that Skip Gates, who's a friend and colleague at Harvard, is completing, there is a film being made that focuses on Frederick Douglass. And it should, if everything goes well, it will be out in theaters in roughly 5 years. And it's a film that focuses just on Frederick Douglass, which I think would be huge. I mean, in the same way Hollywood, I mean, for me, a great question is, why has John Brown never also, he's never been highlighted. I mean, he was in Santa Fe Trail, if any of you have seen Santa Fe Trail from 1940. But I mean, if Santa Fe Trail, Brown becomes across as a fascinating character because he's so demonic. The best way to summarize Brown and Santa Fe Trail is he's like Milton's Satan. He's so demonic that he's actually kind of an interesting figure. But Hollywood has because in part they want to reach and they want to attract such a broad audience, they're very cautious about coming across as being too radical, especially if it's a $80 million above film. Whereas a film like Selma that just came out, that was a $6 million film. Yes. I mean, that was a huge success, a $6 million film that is nominated for an Academy Award Best Picture. That's almost unheard of in Hollywood. But it can afford to be more radical because it only cost $6 million. One thing that Spielberg's Lincoln film has done since it came out is that before Spielberg's Lincoln, history films that had anything to do with any kind of history, were seen as really high-risk films. That you had to be a really courageous filmmaker, and you had to have some courageous producers, some money people on your side for you to do a history film, because it was seen as really high risk. And Spielberg's Lincoln, for all of its flaws, sends a message to Hollywood, hey, maybe it's not as risky as we thought. Maybe we can take a gamble with these other history films. And in my view, the more history films of any kind, the better, because the more people will be drawn to the past as a way to understand our present. Thank you.
I'm not speaking for all black people, and all black people are diverse like anybody else. And yet, in terms of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, a lot of these larger processes that have been in place, it's something that we all can kind of tap to and relate to in a very particular way.